it's hard to overstate, the psychological impact in France of being invaded twice in 2 generations. That's if you think that the Second World War finished in 1945. If you're a Lithuanian or an Estonian, as far as you're concerned, it lasted until 1991.
We will measure our success not only by the battles we win, but also by the wars we end.
Right now, all eyes are on Washington. But who's actually watching Europe at the moment?
And the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry says the death toll in Gaza is now more than 60,000 people since the start of the war.
I'm Venetia Rainey, and this is Battlelines. It's Monday, 1st of December, 2025. The only way to avoid danger is to prepare for it. We need to mobilising the nation to defend itself, to be ready and remain respected. Those were the words of French President Emmanuel Macron last week while announcing his plan to boost the French armed forces through a new voluntary military service scheme. Now, that's not conscription, but it's certainly a significant step towards it. Is this what every Western army needs to be doing? One of the key lessons from the Russian invasion of Ukraine is that military mass is still paramount. But most European armies are a shadow of their former selves, and the UK's is particularly woeful. So on today's episode, we'll be asking, is Europe doing enough to rebuild its armies? Does the UK need to follow in France's footsteps? And what can we learn from Israel in terms of the importance of the reserves to help reconstitute an army in the face of a long, grinding war? To answer these questions, I'm joined by Dr Lynette Nusbacher, a military historian and strategist, and James Crisp, the Telegraph's Europe editor. James, let's start with you. What are the details of this expanded military service that Macron's announced, and what's the reaction been in France?
It's a voluntary scheme, first and foremost, but what it does do is pave the way to potential conscription, mandatory conscription, in the future if there was an emergency. Initially, the numbers will be restricted to 3,000, which they hope to hit by next year, but that should rise to 50,000 by 2035. The idea is that this scheme would usher in a three-tier structure in the French army: professionals, reservists, and volunteers. Now, obviously, the context of this is the war in Ukraine, the threat of Russia. But I think what's also important to understand is why, President Macron, a man who, many people in Britain might see as kind of a wet and woolly centrist, is, so keen on something so tough and manly and old-fashioned, I guess it would seem to some of us. Now, Macron has this idea, this vision for Europe called strategic autonomy, and that's basically the ability for Europe, led by France, of course, to act independently of Washington. Now, that's a long way off, but I think we can see with ideas like this, the offering of the force de frappe, the French nuclear shield, to Germany and to other EU countries, well, we're seeing Macron almost trying to will that into reality, to sort of set up the building blocks for a future when, perhaps a future after peace in Ukraine, when Washington has more or less taken very much a backseat and left Europe responsible for its own security. And that's a Europe, I would predict, would be led by Britain, France, Germany, and Poland. What's telling is a kind of a cultural shift, which I think the French may be more ready for than the Germans. And the new Chief of Staff, General Fabien Mandon, he made quite a stir. He suggested that France had to be psychologically prepared to lose its children in a potential future war with Russia, and that it lacks the spirit, that old sort of de Gaulle spirit, to endure hardship for national defence. And we see, when you look at Germany's plans for voluntary conscription, understandably, because of the historical context of the Second World War, the idea of stationing troops in Eastern Europe, specifically Ukraine, is obviously kind of problematic because of the the horrible legacy of Nazi Germany. But I guess to sum up, Putin's not someone who you can underestimate or really mess about with, and it's time to kind of get real on defence.
I want to come on to that wider question of what other European countries are doing too, and Germany is really interesting, and we did an episode on that a couple of weeks ago that I would encourage our listeners to check out. Lynette, what are your thoughts about what France has proposed, and also not just the policy but the rhetoric around it? As James mentioned, this idea that A confrontation with Russia is imminent in the next 3 to 4 years, and we need to be prepared to send our children to war. Do we need to have a similar sort of language around this issue in the UK, and should we be bringing in something like a voluntary military service?
The French government is starting to create a database that can support future mass recruitment and potentially conscription. And crossing that boundary into the headspace that says we are going to gather the data that is going to support this is a significant step. And if you look at British defense has always tried to keep the use of armed force as an option for government independent of whether the people of the UK are emotionally engaged with that use of force. We like to think that we have a professional army that will do exactly as it's told. The government of the day can use it as a tool of statecraft, and it does not have to go to the country, does not have to make a manifesto commitment or anything that smacks of asking the people of the UK what they think. And seeking to gather the data required for conscription, or even talking about a youth volunteer national service option, is a step that UK government is historically reluctant to take. So whereas the French government on a continent, no significant body of water between them and the Russian armed forces, is committed, the UK does not have that level of commitment, and I don't think a British government is going to seek that level of commitment.
I think, that's very correct for a number of reasons. I mean, the fact is that the experience of invasion, that is one of the things in Europe which is constantly sort of referenced as a major difference in the mindset between British people and Europeans. It's been cited in the conversations about Brexit. It's hard to overstate, the psychological impact in France of being invaded twice in, 2 generations. That's if you think that the Second World War finished in 1945. If you're a Lithuanian or an Estonian, as far as you're concerned, it lasted until 1991. So, these are sort of quite deep-seated, I think, psychological differences. I mean, I don't know, but I wonder if, the idea of being called up to the British Army still has that kind of luster that it once did when, you have independence movements in Wales, in Scotland. Northern Ireland's a bit more complicated, like always. So, I think that it's a very different picture from the last time that there was large-scale conscription, in these islands.
Let me press on the point. A different picture is important here. In the old days, conscription was trying to create large numbers of people in the combat arms and trying to take people out of the slums of Europe, put muskets in their hands and send them to fight. And during the two world wars of the 20th century, there was a lot of generating combat arms force by using fairly crude conscription and selection methods. There was, during the Second World War, a fairly scientific approach to taking the human material coming in, especially to the British Army, and applying psychology and other means to use that human material. But it was very bayonet focused. And I think that when we think about European conscription going forward, we have to think about big data. We have to think about the way that hyperscaled computer applications are able to augment and support any future conscription. And we have to remember that the requirements of fighting a large-scale war going forward will require drone pilots, drone technicians, people able to operate in the data space and the information space. And we're not talking about handing the sweepings of the gutters a musket and telling them to go and shoot at the enemy.
I think, just to sort of add to that, one of the things which give me concern about this whole idea is that this is clearly something which needs a lot of planning. This is a massive national plan, which requires a massive national strategy, political will, and the ability and intelligence to carry it through. So let's just have a little think about some of the other big plans which the government, successive governments, Conservative and Labour, have tried and failed to put together. We can't build a train line from London to Manchester. Do we have an industrial policy? No, I don't think so. How can you expect when, frankly, in the second city of this country, they can't even collect bins? How do you expect to convince people? Right think people to say, yeah, okay, I think that my son should go and pick up a rifle and join in with this great plan, this new sort of national vision. There's been too many failures, and I don't think that there's the trust necessary for people to fall in behind that kind of national project or skill sets.
One of the other things that was said around this French proposal, Thomas Gassiou, the president of the National Assembly's Defence Committee, said, "The new military service moves us in the direction of hybridisation of the armed forces. We went too far in the direction of the all-professional." British armed forces are obviously a professional army. Lynette, can you explain the sort of arguments, the pros and cons of a professional versus a reserve army, and if you think there's a sort of perfect ratio to strike?
It's very important we understand that the professional British Army wants to have an all-professional army and is uncomfortable with the idea that a reserve force might be required to augment the regular army because it takes delivering combat power, it takes conducting operations out of the hands of professionals and makes it all a little bit complicated and difficult. The British Army seeks to be a regular army that is willing to be augmented every now and again by a very small number of reservists. So I think if you ask the British Armed Forces their ideal ratio of regular to reserve, it would be 100 and nil. But political motivations and the realities of recruitment and operations mean that very begrudgingly the British regular forces accept reservists. And the idea that the British regular forces, which has trouble accepting highly motivated reservists, might accept people being marched in and told they had to be there, they had to serve, well, I think it's far-fetched. So conscription with the armed forces as they are now is a non-starter in the United Kingdom. And let me give you a bit of evidence to support my contention that the regular armed forces are uninterested in reservists. The reason why there are so few reservists in the British Armed Forces right now is that when the British Army outsourced conscription to Capita a few years ago, it is very clear that they wanted to have a very, very high standard of reservists coming into the system, perhaps so high a standard they'd rather have none than have somebody who had a slightly iffy medical history. The British Armed Forces outsourced a core function like recruitment precisely because they did not want too many of the wrong sort of people coming in the door.
We're going to take a short break now. Coming up afterwards, is maths really that important for Britain, given the low threat of an invasion? Welcome back. I'm here with Dr Lynette Nusbacher, a military historian and strategist, and James Crisp, the Telegraph's Europe editor. I was at a conference by RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, last week, looking at the idea of long war and how prepared the UK is. Not prepared at all. I'll give a very brief summary of the conference's conclusions. But there was a whole session on the importance of reservists, and how you need a second echelon and a third echelon to reboot the army, to reconstitute the army after that initial wave has been into war. Now, we might not be facing a war against Russia like Ukraine is now, but we might still be in a prolonged hybrid war, for example. Can you just explain the process of these echelons and how important reservists are to reboot, to reconstitute the army in the event of a long war?
Shall I use the Israeli example?
Please, yes.
So the way the Israelis generate force is by using their regular army to craft the people that they will use on operations. What I mean by that is the Israeli regular army is there to recruit and train a regular force. Israeli conscripts are there in order to be future reservists. So 17, 18-year-olds come into the Israeli system as conscripts. They are assessed and evaluated using some fairly swept-up tools of testing and evaluation, and they are assigned to whatever the IDF psychology branch and manpower branch think they could do best. And for the rest of their military careers, in the first instance as conscripts, and then as reservists, and then as older reservists, they are doing what the system thinks they need to do, and they are in the system for a period of decades. So you use the word echelon. The first echelon in this case are conscripts being brought in by the regulars. They're being trained by older conscripts and regulars. And then after a period of months, they're released back into the economy. And that way, the economy doesn't have the hit of a lot of people on full-time military service. But when they're needed for operations, they can be mobilized in a matter of hours. And as they get older and less fit for some tasks, like running around with a bayonet in their hand or driving tanks for hours on end, they get shifted into depth tasks, into training tasks, and eventually they lose their reserve commitment altogether when they're in their 30s and 40s. And unless they have particular specialist skills, they are fully released into the economy, and they're no longer subject to the drag of being sent off to do military service. Now, when the British armed forces have tried to take on this idea, and I've been in a room with a bunch of senior British officers in Israel getting a lecture on this subject, they came out and they said, wow, the Israelis use the regular force to generate their reserve force, which they use on operations. The British Army uses its reserve force to augment its regular force. They really felt that the Israelis had got the cart before the horse, that the Israelis were configured this way. Well, for obvious reasons, they needed to get a big army out of a small population. They've got a land border and they've got a lot of threat. And they really felt that the British Army could not even start to generate force the way that the Israelis do.
Are there lessons that you think the British Armed Forces should be taking from the Israelis, or are the situations so fundamentally different, as you mentioned, Israel facing threat on multiple land borders, countries within the region, whereas UK, the threat of invasion feels relatively low, but we could still face other threats. Are there lessons we should be taking?
I'll tell you the first thing that we need to do if we want to take a lesson from the Israelis. Apart from setting aside the emotional charge that talking about the Israeli armed forces has in the United Kingdom, we need to look at the way the Israelis take an entire generation of humans, of human material, and assess them for what they can do best, for how they can best contribute to an effort. And the Israelis use psychological testing, psychometric testing, physical fitness testing, and they do it across an entire year of 17-year-olds, 16 and 17-year-olds. And they are determined to make the best use of those people in generating armed forces. And I think that is such a class-free, such a distinction-free, such a potential sensitive way of viewing humans. James said earlier that we haven't got an industrial strategy. We have got a really sharp defense industrial strategy, but we're unable even to implement the defense industrial strategy that we have just spent a couple of years creating. We don't take a view of our people free of the taint of class structures, free of the taint of who your parents are. And that's something the Israelis do that we should look to.
James, I wonder if you can come in on that point, because the French in particular have a very long history of conscription, actually. When I was reading about it, this idea of the citizen soldier that dates back to the French Revolution, which I guess gives them a very different mindset on the idea of signing up to join the army.
Yeah, I think that's true, and it is interesting. I mean, these roots go deep. I mean, Britain has historically had one of the smallest land armies in Europe because we had a very good and big navy. Whereas the French, of course, used to be one of the biggest armies in Europe, if you think back to Napoleon and all of that stuff, and this idea that, compulsory military training is something you have to do was part of French culture from the French Revolution on, the citizen soldier, as you say. And I mean, I guess really that and maybe it changed for the same reason in Britain, really, as the age of European empires came to an end. The last major conflict fought by French conscripts was the Algerian War of Independence. And I think one of the final ones where British conscripts were involved was fighting Chinese communist bandits in Malaya. So, there's an idea. I mean, would people be more comfortable about risking their children's lives if you're defending the homeland, or if you're maintaining a colony?
How is this debate playing out outside of France, outside of the UK, elsewhere in Europe?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of similarities. There are a lot of similarities about if we sort of look at the big beasts. So, I think that if America does step back, the future security architecture of Europe will be basically led by a combination of Britain, France, Germany, Poland, and realistically speaking, Ukraine, because, they will be the porcupine, the first line of defense, fundamentally. So Germany's had decades and decades of sort of chronic underinvestment in its army. This so-called peace dividend after the end of the Cold War. Again, the historical reasons with the Third Reich, which we've sort of discussed several times already. But look, it has a new military service plan. That means all 18-year-old men have to fill out a questionnaire on their suitability to serve, and from 2027 to undergo medical screening. I mean, I have German friends, they had a sort of a form of national service called Zivildienst, where you could actually go and do other things other than military service, work in care homes, and quite a lot of them actually did do that. But the Bundeswehr now, we're talking about 182,000 troops, and they want to boost that by 20,000, along with the which I know on battlelines you guys have discussed a lot, how much more money will be going into the Bundeswehr as well. So I think, again, young Germans are wary of it, as you'd expect, because this is something which, it is part of the national psychology now, the guilt of the Second World War, wariness about pacifism, which, at its best has made Germany the richest country in Europe, and at its worst, has made it perhaps a little bit too forgiving of Russia at times. So I'm not convinced that with the German thing we'll have the kind of voluntary pickup that you might see in France. I think Poland is very interesting because, you're talking about a country which borders Ukraine, country which, was once referred to the state on wheels. It was, so often sort of invaded and dissected and moved around the place by sort of larger belligerent neighbors. Well, they've got, for now, the largest military in Europe, and they want 300,000 troops. That's their goal. They are coming up with a major sort of defense training program, which includes education with the army courses in schools. So you'd be training school kids in marksmanship, for example, which I don't know. I mean, my son's 8. I don't know. I'm not sure I'm ready in 5 years for him to pick up a rifle. I don't know. I mean, make it harder for him to do his homework.
So I do know because last year, you may remember right before the election in 2024, the government did suggest some form of national service. I think the then government was very clear that they were talking about something more approaching Zivildienst or comparable set of or a comparable set of options. But I promise you, every doorbell I rang in my part of England, the response was, I don't want my children sent off to die in a foreign field, not I am unhappy with the idea of my child getting a bit of structure in their life and building a bit of social cohesion across the United Kingdom. They instantly went to to what we talk about on Remembrance Sunday, about the idea of war and conscription leading directly to the mass slaughter of my children. And that's what they think.
And I mean, I think what's sort of kind of chilling about that is that is exactly what people thought in the run up to World War II. You know, they were thinking about, the sort of the moves towards pacifism or the sort of the reluctance to sort of challenge Hitler was motivated very much, I think, by the sort of the deeply traumatic experience of World War One. But, worryingly, at the end of the day, there comes a point where you have to draw a line in the sand and fight.
Yeah. If a country has a clear understanding of its national interests, of its vital national interests, then a country can understand what is and isn't worth sending our children to fight and die for. The problem that we have in the United Kingdom, and it's worse now than it certainly was this time last year, is that we don't have a sharp idea of our vital national interests. We don't know what is and isn't in British government policy that is worth dying for. And I don't think British governments like the idea of creating that clear and understanding of national interest, because I think governments really like the luxury of being able to blow with the wind and blow with the wind of public opinion.
Does the British government need to be making more of a case for, and Lynette, you touched on this earlier, people won't necessarily be going out to die in a trench. They might be operating drones. They might be helping out with intelligence. They might be protecting vital national infrastructure here in the UK, drone spotting around Heathrow, for example, or rallying the neighbourhood if there's a cyber attack that disrupts the local supermarket, that kind of stuff. Does the government need to be making more of an argument that you should be joining your local reserve unit to help protect the homeland, like James was saying, and it's not necessarily going to involve you or your children dying?
The government, in the first instance, has to ensure that we create the skill sets and the understanding amongst our population that will make them useful as future reservists or future regulars. And the Ministry of Defense has, in creating its National Defense Industrial Strategy, laid out what people need to start to study at university and start to learn in colleges of further education to be the human material we will need in future. The problem we have is that it's easy to make a strategy, and it's easy to say that colleges of further education need to teach people the skills they need to build and repair drones. But because we are, as a state, paralyzed in our approach to implementation, and because we as a state don't even want to tell young people what they should be doing, where their abilities should take them, it's really hard for us to say that we are going to have the reservists or the regulars, or God help us, the conscripts we would need to fight a future war. The war we're seeing now, that I call it World War 3.0, the world war that we see in Ukraine, we saw between Israel and Iran, that we're seeing in the information space, that is a completely different kind of conflict. And it's hard for us even to understand it. And if we look towards the kind of war we'll be fighting in 5 years, with a lot more artificial intelligence, kinds of artificial intelligence we don't currently have, with a lot more autonomy in our combat systems, with flying killer robots out there killing people, that is a world that we need to prepare for. but we don't have a way to tell people, go and study this, go and study that, that proves to be effective.
James, do you think that World War 3.0, do you think that's better understood or better communicated on the continent?
No, not necessarily. I think it's exactly the same. I think that, just as British parents would have their sort of anxieties about children going to fight, I think French parents would feel exactly the same way. I mean, listening to Lynette sort of speaking then, I was sort of struck by, actually is conscription the answer to all of this? I mean, isn't the whole point of AI and all of this mechanization that you need fewer people, not more? I mean, do we really need to start drafting huge amounts of people in? And also, why isn't the army sorted all this out itself? It's meant to be a professional army.
When you look at the origins, I should say, of French conscription during the French Revolution, one of the things that they talked about was optimizing the use of human material. They talked about, carrying the old men out into the streets to make patriotic speeches because no one must stand idle. And the idea that we need to make that kind of efficient use of the British people is, I would suggest, something that we haven't even started to talk about.
I think a good first step would be to sort of rip off the Marseillaise, which is a much more inspiring national anthem than our own.
It is the best national anthem in Europe apart from our own. You woke cuck, you, James Crisp.
I'd be interested to get your views on that, though, Lynette. Do we still need mass, or is James right? Is chasing mass a conflict that is very unlikely to come to the UK, and we need to be thinking more strategically, particularly given, frankly, the historic British aversion to conscription?
Yeah, if you asked experts 15 years ago, 20 years ago about future warfare, a lot of people would tell you that mass was no longer important and that what really mattered would be the electronics. What would really matter would be the speed and tempo of operations. And in a sense, they'd be right. And then in 2022, suddenly there is heavy metal warfare on the continent of Europe. There are tanks, there are armored artillery pieces, and there are infantry soldiers in trenches. So out of one side of my mouth, I will tell you that mass is always important because killing and destruction is the currency of warfare. That never changes, and mass must be part of that. But out of the other side of my mouth, I'll say that when we look at Ukraine right now, and we see the way lightly held sectors of defensive systems in Ukraine are being defended by Ukrainian soldiers heavily augmented by unstaffed systems, we are seeing that the mass does not only come in the mass mobilization of human material. As we know, I keep on saying human material, it's going to sound terrible. It's going to sound like I'm not talking about humans. We know that the Ukrainians have held back from mobilizing their youngest conscripts. We know that they are doing that for social reasons, and we know that it means there is a whole generation of people in their 20s in Ukraine with combat experience that includes using force multipliers like drones, like independent autonomous systems, in ways that change our idea of what mass means.
I think as well, Finland is a very interesting example on this, with their concept of total defense. It's obviously a small country with a huge border with Russia. And they have this whole of society approach with, conscription, reserves. I mean, I think it does actually involve most people having a gun at home, which I'm not sure we're quite sort of psychologically ready for. But, sort of regional forces sort of set up to allow for a rapid kind of local response. And I wonder if I don't know if that's a model which could be rolled out across Europe or if that's something which is kind of uniquely Finnish thing.
One of the things that the Finns have a very clear understanding of is what threat they're trying to deal with. And I'll also say that if you want to talk to people who understand Russian doctrine, the first place to go is to talk to the Finns and the Georgians, because that's who confronts the Russians. One of the things that we are just showing ourselves to be utterly unfit to deal with is combat in the information space. That is, we are vulnerable not just to the Russians flying platforms, bombers, and sailing ships off our coast to provoke us, but they are all over our social media. They are all over our politics. And we need to understand what our particular vulnerabilities are, the way that the Finns understand what their particular vulnerabilities are. So I agree that understanding the enemy and focusing on what we might need to do to defend ourselves against the enemy is really important for us. But the way that we will be engaged behind our moat, behind the Channel, behind the North Sea, past the Royal Navy, the way we will be engaged is not by the Russians coming across with snow on their boots. We are being engaged by the Russians in the information space, and we need to be able to focus on that too.
That was Dr Lynette Nusbacher, a military historian and strategist, and James Crisp, the Telegraph's Europe editor. That's all for today's episode, but before we leave, I'm going to share a few more reviews that we've had. David Smith wrote in to say, David Blair knows his stuff. I like Battlelines. I think it's very well done and not just propaganda. I'm an American and I enjoy other countries' point of views. Well done, David and Battlelines. Very much worth listening to. Keep up the good work. Thank you, David. We really appreciate that sort of feedback. Here's one from the other side of the aisle. Scruffy Bear wrote to say, is this podcast a joke? Jonathan is no Kissinger. The UK has cut and cut its bases, the Navy, the Army and Air Arm so much for the past 50 years. Kissinger could and did call upon SAC, B-52s, MAC C-5s, F-4 Marines Army, etc., etc. Powell has what? Nothing. Bloviating hot air. The universe doesn't care. There are 3 capitals on planet Earth that count: Washington, Moscow, Beijing. That's it. If you want a seat at the top table, then jack up military spending 500% or just shut up. Embarrassing. Thank you, Scruffy Bear. We appreciate that feedback too. And you probably have a point, to be honest. And finally, one from Fred from New York. This Thanksgiving, I'm grateful that my favourite podcast is British and doesn't shut down for a week because of a major holiday. I take back all the times I shook my fist at every random bank holiday. Thank you for the work you're doing. History will appreciate it. That was one sent to us from over Thanksgiving. And just to let you know that, yes, we will be keeping to our usual publishing schedule over Christmas and New Year, so you're welcome. We'll be back again on Friday. Until then, that's all for Battlelines. Goodbye. Battlelines is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles and hosted by me, Venetia Rainey, and Roland Oliphant. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battlelines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. To stay on top of all of our news, subscribe to The Telegraph, sign up to our Dispatches newsletter, or listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. You can get in touch directly by emailing battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or contact us on X. You can find our handles in the show notes. The producer is Max Bauer. The executive producer is Louisa Wells.